So for this idea of, as Washington as needing networks, right? If you look at the Constitution, I mean, it doesn't talk about that at all, right?
Yeah.
It's a machine and it's a voting machine. And this concept of relationships, it's outside of, any written machinery. It's an informal, human, spontaneous kind of need that everyone has, right? It's
Yeah.
human nature. So when you look at the way networks are working in Congress, and you've done some work as well on collaboration or networks between Democrats and Republicans, for instance, what do you see as where things are and where could they go? What's healthy networks and what's unhealthy networks, I guess, is a question for Congress as an institution.
I really like the way you put that question, because I think there's a natural tension between these two schools of thought. On the one hand, like you said, humans are naturally social beings, right? We form attachments with one another in very familial, innate ways. And so our ability to form groups with one another and to make associations with one another, nobody has to be taught that. Like, that's just inherently part of being human. On the other hand, we also know from decades of economic and political theory that humans have a really hard time overcoming individual incentives to form collective action. And so to me, there's this tension here. So is politics natural homophily? Are we naturally forming these social groups, or do we have to overcome our reticence to form groups in order to achieve political goals? And so, of course, in reality, it's both of those things. In reality, we are on the one hand, using institutions to solve collective action problems when our individual incentives are getting in the way. And on the other hand, we are within those institutions that we build to do that stuff, we are naturally engaging with one another and creating connections with one another that is rewiring the way that people are connected. And so I see it as both of those things. There are both of these forces working in tandem with one another. And I think the tension between them and understanding what drives that tension is particularly important. So to be a little bit more concrete about this, some of the work that I'm doing now and the book that I'm writing looks at the conditions under which Republicans and Democrats will collaborate or cooperate on things in Congress. And I'm interested in the way that the network patterns between them teach us stuff about those conditions. And so the types of behaviors or outcomes that I'm most interested in is, when do we see trust, for example? When do we see Republicans and Democrats engage in relationships that exhibit trust between one another? We hear all the time about the breakdown of trust and the affective polarization between the parties and so forth. But there's lots of evidence of some trusting relationships. So when do we see trust? When do we see cooperation and resilience to use the pandemics on everybody's minds right now? When do the network connections help cross partisans to sort of repel outside forces that disrupt their pattern of connection? So what types of networks do we see that are more resilient to those types of infections, you might say? And then also, I think we have to rethink the way we understand power from the perspective of networks. Sometimes power is the most central person, the person who literally can pull the most levers and make the most things happen. But I think power is also found in the brokers, in the bridges, in the people who have the ability to bring opposite parties together on topics. And they may not be the most visible folks. In fact, they may try to fly under the radar. They may try to do it covertly. But I think understanding what makes a power broker effective is really important. So those are the types of outcomes that I'm interested in understanding as we look at networks between Republicans and Democrats. And of the different types of networks that I can observe, And I guess I should pause there to say, in reality, the thing that I want to observe, I can't observe. Like there is a true network of all political relationships of everybody who knows who and how, and through history, and who went to grade school together, and whose kids are on the same soccer team together, and whatever. And we just can't observe that true network of all of these complicated relationships, and we don't know its bounds. But if we just look at the 435 members of the House, and we just look at the networks that we can observe, of the observable ones, then we can understand the properties of those observable networks that I think give us clues as to the conditions under which they result in trust and resilience and power. And so I've looked at caucus networks, as we've mentioned, or co-sponsorship, people who co-sponsor the same bills, people who sit on the same committees. So these co-participating relationships that members of Congress form. Because those relationships are driven by these very formal institutions, they have different features. And what I've come to in my work is that there are two features that make network connections the most useful for bipartisan trust and cooperation. And those two features are voluntarism and sustainability. So a caucus, for example, is a voluntary commitment. You don't join a caucus unless you want to. It's a voluntary thing, and you leave if you're done with it or you are dissatisfied in some way. So connections that are made voluntarily. Whereas with a committee, like everybody has to join a committee, and you are assigned to go to your committee. You don't really have a choice about that. So voluntary connections in some ways are going to be more meaningful than involuntary ones. And sustained connections are going to be more meaningful than unsustained connections. So caucuses, except to the extent that they're very weak tie connections, are sustained over time. Committee participation, certainly sustained over time. Co-sponsorship, not at all sustained. That's a one-time thing. You co-sponsor a bill together. So to me, looking at the nature of whether or not people are entering bipartisan relationships in a way that's voluntary and in a way that's lasting can tell us a lot about the utility of those cross-partisan relationships for normatively, sort of legislatively positive bipartisan outcomes. So I think there's a tendency for people to lament about how members of Congress, they're only there from Tuesday to Thursday. They don't hang out together. They don't live in boarding houses together anymore. They don't go to so many cocktail parties and so on. Like they're not socializing with each other. And that lack of social relationship between them impedes the legislative process. And, yes and no, I think. There is something to that. But it is absolutely clear to me through my research that the casual connections made through those just voluntary sort of one-off social connections do not at all overcome the very stringent institutional constraints provided by partisanship and committees. I think those types of relationships matter. Congress might be better off if were having more cocktail parties and spent more time with each other, but it's not going to fix Congress. I don't think it's going to make it altogether a more functional institution or workplace.
I'm curious about your perspective on this network analysis, and particularly when you create you create a relationship between two people, right? You have a kind of a node in the network, and you've identified this idea of voluntarism and this idea of, it's obviously works better if it's repeated, and that strengthens this node, if you will. We've talked on this program in the past about the role of transparency, and when the cameras are on all the time, it's hard to, at least there's a theory that it's hard to make relationships. Whereas if you're in a back room and no one's looking, then that's a time when people can actually talk to each other and they can build relationships. Honest. Have you looked at that concept at all as a potential measure of whether this node is going to take hold or not? Whether there's some kind of privacy versus a transparency in the formation of these network bonds?
That's a really great point, and I think you're right. I think we do have good evidence that relationships or deals or connections are often more sincere or more productive when they are behind closed doors, when people aren't feeling the weight of the fishbowl on them. I don't have great data on that. I don't have, with the type of data, congressional data that I've looked at, I don't have a great example of connections that are made in more private form. I think there are folks out there that have that kind of data. I don't know what's being published from it, but there are organizations that are, they run these training retreats and or actually, I know a good example is the Codels. And there is a group of scholars working on this, and I can't remember who they are at the top of my head. But looking at, Codel is a congressional delegation made up of members of Congress who go on a trip together. There used to be a lot of international Codels, and maybe they were thought of as junkets. And there's still a lot of domestic ones, I think, that go on. And they came under a lot of scrutiny as being expensive and bloated and just like a public paid for vacation. But I think there's pretty good evidence that the relationships made while you travel with somebody to learn about a topic are actually valuable relationships, and they can be meaningful. So I don't have the Codel data, but the folks who do, I think that would be a great way to look at, to compare that to a more transparent. I think of the Codel as a bit more of a secretive, not totally behind closed doors, but a bit more of that private type of linkage that you're talking about relative to the, co-voting or co-sponsorship kind of connection.
And it might make sense for caucuses to take an increased kind of power role if, as compared with committees, since committees have become so transparent, right, and very difficult for people to talk. Whereas in a caucus, you can sort of do everything in a private setting, in theory.
No, I think you're right. I think there is the potential for caucuses to play a more private role. The fact that caucuses don't have any authority of any kind, I think probably diminishes. I mean, you'd have to ask the members of Congress this, I guess, but my guess is that it diminishes in their mind what they could do with the connections. When I've interviewed members of Congress and staffers about the value that they see in caucuses or the waste of time or whatever it is, what I mostly hear about is access to information that they wouldn't get otherwise and access to relationships that they wouldn't get otherwise. But I don't hear a whole lot about how it helps them to advocate for something that they couldn't advocate, or make progress with something, or kill something that they were trying to kill, or whatnot. So in terms of a private setting that can help create more functional relationships, I think you're right. But in terms of something that might then, like the jump from that to translate into legislative productivity, I feel like there might be a step missing there.
Great. Well, maybe it's time for us to move on to some of the questions I ask all of our guests, to see if we can compare the answers in the future and see where people agree and differ. So are you ready to move on?
Yeah, I feel like this part is the test.
The first question is the hardest one. What do you think congressional representation should mean?
Yeah, that's really hard. So I think representation is a really challenging topic. And because we live in a very diverse society that is growing and getting more diverse every day in lots of different ways. And our understanding of diversity and what it means to be human and how we identify in different categories as humans is still changing. So I'm not sure that there's like a code or a recipe that we can put on, like a quota system that, Congress would be truly representative if we had, filled these particular buckets in these particular proportions, because we just never know exactly what the lineup of buckets needs to be, because that definition is changing all the time. So in a way, I think there is some hard and fast, almost rules that we could apply to some representation. If there are very defined, visible populations in the United States that are underrepresented in Congress, if you think of maybe a population like Native Americans or those with disabilities, that are, or you could think of children. There's lots of populations that are plentiful in the United States that have either zero or very, very little real descriptive representation. in Congress. And when we see that, I think we need to think about that and what are the ways to address that if there are logical ones, because the research on this topic suggests that under some conditions, quota systems work. Like if there are big underrepresented populations and you create gender quotas, for example, like they've done in India in some places, you get more representation of women, for example. I think the limits of using that type of forced representation system are real. I don't think you can use that type of system forever. And I think it's, I think you have to use that type of system very, very carefully and strategically. So then the other side of the coin is how much of representation is just whether or not people feel represented, right? So I am a overeducated, middle-aged white woman. Do I feel like, a Black male high school graduate could represent me well in Congress? Well, yeah, depending on how that person stands on issues and, how they talk about things. And if they're, if I feel like that person is representing me in the ways that I want to be represented, then absolutely. So at some point it comes down to whether or not people feel represented. So descriptive representation is important, and I think we need to pay attention to it. But substantive representation is paramount in that sense.
So
I don't know. I'm filibustering this a little bit because it's such a hard question.
Well, I want to take a little bit more of the view of the member
Okay.
or of the senator, right? So if you're a member, you're a senator, who do you represent? Do you represent? And this is a personal opinion that I'm asking for from you. Is do you represent the people who voted for you? Do you represent everyone in your district? Do you represent? That's the first question: is who do you represent? And the second question is how. But the first question is who. Yeah,
I think there's no question that you represent everybody in your district. I think if our representatives were only representing the people that voted for them, then, I think that really skews our sense of representative democracy.
Or if they just represented their primary voters.
Right.
That would be even worse.
That would be even worse.
Yeah. So
the how is really hard though, because the how suggests that it suggests a preference aggregation that is unrealistic, right? So if I'm a member of Congress and I have 750,000 constituents, and my goal in representing those 750,000 people is to figure out what they all think on, bike lanes or rapid transit or whatever it is I'm being asked to vote on that day. It's just not possible to know that. And it's not possible to know it not just because I can't go around and ask all of them all the time, but because they will not be of one mind. It's not like there is a consensus to be known. Not just that it's a hard thing to know, but that it is unknowable because it doesn't exist, right? So, the mathematics, without going too far into the weeds, the mathematics of Arrow's theorem is really compelling, right? So you get it to a large group of people, by large, really, I mean more than three, and you ask them to tell me their, rank order your preferences over, 5 things or much less 100 things, and you're going to get cycles. There will be no consensus over what the preferred outcome is. And so I think that puts the onus of representation on being thoughtful about what maybe you think those 750,000 people think, but also with the understanding that they are not of one mind. And, even if you could poll all of them on Tuesday, they'd come up with a different answer polling them on Thursday.
Well, there is a question of whether you need to do that at all. So, there's two minds about that kind of representation. One is, are you reflecting just the beliefs, in some kind of aggregated form, a majority belief kind of system where you come into all the problems you just mentioned, or whether you are of the opinion that the representative makes his own judgments about what he thinks is in the best interest in the long term of his district. And so those are two different approaches. I'm curious where you fall down on those.
Yeah, it's the classic trustee or delegate kind of perspective. And this is why I think that we probably don't spend enough time in politics talking about values. And, at the end of the day, if I'm a member of Congress, I can't know what all my constituents think. But I can explain to them what my values are, what drives my value system, what my priorities are, what norms, democratic norms or whatnot, I think are most important to follow. And as a voter, I think voters need that information. I think voters need to know the sort of the what the guiding principles are that that their representatives are following, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to help them make decisions, is those values and of course the relationship they have with their party, rather than their individual opinion on any one topic, which is probably not all that important.
But it sounds like from the way you described earlier is that you think a member should reflect beliefs of his district or his or her district if they're known. And if they're not,
I think they're unknowable. So
you think they're unknowable. So you move to the judgment version of representation out of necessity.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, that's a decent summary of my view.
Okay, great. Good. Next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time? And this means, in DC versus home versus legislation versus oversight. So how would you break it down?
Yeah. So, I think members of Congress have a really important job and we send them to go do that job. And so I think they should spend most of their time in DC. And I think they should be, in an ideal world, members of Congress have lawmaking responsibilities, oversight responsibilities, representation responsibilities, and there's a fourth one that I always tell my undergrads that I've just lost. It's like 4 main jobs, and I'm blanking on the fourth one. Let's just go with the 3 then. And so I'd like to see a Congress that is engaged in those 3 or 4, whatever the fourth one is, things most of the time. And that can come in a lot of different forms. But if they're spending, roughly 25-30% of their time actually doing lawmaking, actually legislating, advancing legislation, killing legislation, advocating, writing, whatever, learning, I think that would be positive. Another 25 to 30% of their time engaged in oversight would be great. It would elevate the function of Congress to its designed position that it's not really fulfilling right now. Another 25 to 35 to 30% of its time engaged in representation. That can come in lots of different forms. That can come in meeting with Girl Scout troops, or going to cocktail parties, or giving speeches, or serving on panels, or whatnot. I think representation behaviorally can come in lots of forms, but it should be a public and visible and accountable kind of thing. That's what I think they should be spending their time doing. Unfortunately, I don't think they get to spend much of their time doing those things.
So it sounds like mostly DC, mostly legislation and oversight work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. So the next question is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
I think that depends on what purpose or outcome we're going for, right? If we're just talking about debate or deliberation with respect to a new issue that has arisen, a new problem that Congress needs to address, maybe it's not something that we're sure Congress needs to take action on, but they need to know about or they need to learn about. I think that could come in a lot of different forms that could be both educational and dyadic in terms of producing dialogue between members. But if it's something that requires action, or we're deciding whether or not maybe we need to act on something and we need to pass a bill or whatever it is, where there's a much more specific target involved, I think that type of dialogue requires a lot of structure. The Robert's Rules of Order, the rules that parties and committees develop to structure dialogue, I think, create stability, right? So to me, the trade-off in the way that Congress can organize any group really is having a lax structure that allows for more free flow and more creativity and more probably innovation and contributions from sources external and so forth, which can be really good for general problem solving or general learning, versus a system that will produce outcomes that is stable. So the really structured system with lots of rules that is stable, that will produce outcomes, is not going to be the one that is best for innovation and creativity and all of that. So there's a trade-off, I think, between the two systems. And I think it would be great if Congress had access to more of both of those things, and could have designed spaces and formats that would facilitate one versus the other. I absolutely think we have to have, when we need to actually pass bills to solve society's problems, we have to have structure. Without a lot of rules that govern the way that process works and the way people participate in that process, it will never reach conclusion. It would be a chaotic, constantly overturning itself kind of mess. And so if we want stability and we want outcomes, we have to agree to restrain ourselves in the debate in order to produce it. But I don't think that means we need to always do that. Sometimes we can have debate just to have debate. We see the Senate doing a lot of that. It used to do more of it, I think, now than it does, where it's more performative. But having spaces where people can feel comfortable in a free-flowing dialogue, maybe outside of public view, in that more private space, as you were talking about earlier, I think can have great value for, again, innovation and creativity and sharing perspectives.
And do you think that kind of freewheeling part of it, the unstructured part of the discussion, would that be more in committee? Would it be in your caucuses? Would it be at a bar? Where do you think that should happen?
I think any of those are possible. I mean, of the ones you just mentioned, a committee is going to have more structure because committees actually do sometimes have to produce outcomes. But I think if committees have the option to close their door and have a discussion or invite in witnesses in closed door settings for the purpose of giving everybody the sort of freedom to say and do what they want, I think that could be really productive. It could also be seen as corrupt or inappropriate in the public's eye. So I think you have to be careful with that kind of stuff, because perceptions matter. But creating safe and private spaces for members to interact with one another, I think is valuable, and I don't think they have enough opportunity to do that kind of thing. But I think it's really hard to create. We live in a social media world, a 24/7 media world, where everything is scrutinized, and lots of politicians do lots of stuff for the purpose of cajoling that media. So I think it's really challenging to figure out how to create that kind of space.
Agreed. So next question is about what fundamental institutional improvement you would make to Congress within the next 50 years.
Great. I like this question a lot. So I think that we are, as a democracy in the United States, at a pivotal point. I think we have seen some degradation of democratic institutions, and we have a stringent political party system that sits on top of a constitutional checks and balances system in ways that are incompatible with one another, and that place so much constraint on the system that it's not operating. Essentially, I think the framers built a series of compromises in the Constitution whose purpose was to prevent dominant factions from overtaking the government. And that operated like that for a little while, and then parties were born and operated on top of that. And so parties are a constraint, and then the checks and balances and all the rest of it are a constraint. And so what we have now is so much constraint that we have much less functionality, which is giving the executive branch greater authority and relative power to the legislative branch, which is not the design, right? That's in fact less democratic in a sense. And so what I would like to see is reforms that would make Congress resurgent, that would make Congress more the primary branch of government over the executive branch. So more specifically, I would expand the size of the House considerably, maybe, 750, 850, consider doubling the size of the House. And you move to multi-member congressional districts so that with more seats and multi-member districts, and then to elect those multi-member districts, you would need a different kind of ballot system. So let's get rid of first past the post. And I think there's lots of other good options out there, whether it's ranked choice voting or some other alternative in that vein. But with those three reforms, you would essentially break up the two-party system. You would create the conditions for multi-partyism, which would have it has some downsides, but it also has some huge upsides. And the most important upside is that I think you would increase that sense of representation. We were talking earlier about the sense of, do people feel represented, and do they feel represented by people who don't look like them? In a multi-party system, many more people are much more likely to feel like they are represented by somebody or have representation by those that they are more satisfied with, rather than being forced into the two-partyism. I think that would be not, you don't have to amend the Constitution to do those things. You do have to change a couple of laws, but I think it would be absolutely transformational for U.S. democracy on the House side. On the Senate side, I don't know. It depends on how radical I'm feeling. The most radical version is to simply get rid of the Senate and move to a unicameral. The Senate's, I say this as a former Senate staffer. I did that fellowship in the Senate for the year. And as the Senate has a lot of wonderful qualities, but it's hugely unrepresentative in ways that I think are problematic for the democracy. So the most radical thing would just be to dispense with it. The less radical thing would be to, think about state representation, to think about moving away from the 2 senators per state rule, and maybe not, I don't know, there's something along the lines of a more House of Lords version of a second body that doesn't quite have the same legislative authority as the lower chamber, but still has some check and some heft and some gravitas and some representational benefit to it. What exactly that would look like, I don't know. I think in reality, none of that will happen. But I do think it's nice to think about it. If we're going to keep the Senate as a true bicameral functioning part of Congress, though, I do think we have to either significantly reform the filibuster or get rid of it altogether, because it has just not in terms of its rules, but the norms by which it has developed over the years have just become so constraining on the legislative process that it just has a way outsized influence on what Congress can do in a way that I think is detrimental.
All right, next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
Oh, wow. I actually didn't know this question was coming, although I should have.
So many books.
Yeah, it's really too many books. So I'm going to cheat and say the first 2 that came to my mind. Although if you want to peg me into one, that's going to be a problem. But the first 2 that come to my mind, just things that I've read in the last, 5 years or so, are Democracy for Realists by Chris Aiken and Larry Bartels. That I think is one of the things that I've read in the last 5 years that really changed the way that I think about what the purpose of democracy is, what the purpose of elections are, what the fantasies are that we believe about it, and how to get a little bit more pragmatic about what a democracy is and how to run one. And then Lee Drutman's book about the two-party doom loop and democratic reforms that we could. I think Lee does a really nice job and a very accessible job to a broad readership in thinking about it, and both describing the literature and what we know scientifically on the topic, but then also in proscribing what types of reforms might affect some of those problems. So those are the two shout outs I'll give there.
Great. Well, the last question is an easy one. What are your future plans? What do you have in store, with your book, and what do you have coming in the next 5-10 years?
So my big goal is to finish writing this book. So the conditions under which members of Congress collaborate and work together from this network perspective. So, and the book is a little bit more ambitious in terms of offering political scientists a network-oriented framework for understanding politics. So the working title of the book right now has to do with emergent politics, that politics is a network feature that emerges from the nodes and edges, from the connections within the network. And so all the outcomes that we observe, whether it's election outcomes or legislative outcomes or whatnot, are really just the product of the way that relationships get formed in politics. And my little working map in my head of emergent politics, for me at least, provides a way to reconcile this idea of, are humans naturally social, or are we natural individualists that have a hard time overcoming our collective action dilemmas, and helps me understand how and when and why we can expect those politics to emerge. But it's a really very data-oriented project. And so in addition to the book, I'd really like to have some type of public web portal that where folks could come on and type in an issue or a member or a committee or whatnot, and get a visual map, a visual network map. Again, we can't observe all the connections, but we have lots of observable relationships between members of Congress. And so if you want to know more about, scientific disease research and what Congress is doing at it, you type that in and it would provide you the network map of, who are the most central players, who are those bridging players that are creating the brokerage between Republicans and Democrats, who are the ones that are, how are the clusters forming differently in the communities in the network. So a database that has a very visual, very descriptive a front end to it that, in my mind, could be really useful to either, a casual observer of politics, or an advocate, or a journalist, or a student who just wants to better understand how things tick and why things happen in Congress.
Awesome. Well, Professor Victor, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me to play along with you.
Thank you.